It was almost exactly 100 years ago that Pius XI started this celebration of Christ the King, December 11th, 1925. And he wrote a letter to everybody and said why he was doing it. He had been looking around the world and observing what had been happening. There was a civil war had taken place in Mexico. About 1 million civilians were killed in the Civil War. Another 1 million combatants were killed. The group that won the Civil War pretty much repressed religion in Mexico. They closed all the Catholic schools. They took possession of every Catholic church. They killed priests for walking around publicly in their clerics. They could only wear their clerics inside churches. At times, they would suppress all sacraments. You couldn't have Mass, couldn't baptize, couldn't hear confessions. There was another rebellion later on, the Cristero rebellion, to at least fight, to at least have Mass again in Mexico. There was another civil war in Russia. In that revolution, in that civil war, about 13 million people died. And we all know the results of that one. We had communism in the Soviet Union, suppressing faith, family, suppressing all kinds of freedoms. There was a world war, and in that world war, about 10 million combatants died, another 7 million just ordinary folks living their lives. Pope Pius looked at all that and saw also the rise of the nation state happening. Nations were beginning to rally the people around their nation, and secularism was taking hold. There was a small party in Germany that was becoming very popular called the Nazi Party. To all of that, looking at what happened in Mexico and Russia and World War I, what would be happening later in China, to all of that, he thought, well, the only thing we can do, because we can't fight against all that as a church, but we can remind our people who's in charge. That Jesus is king not only of some little country, but as you heard in that opening prayer, what today is Jesus is king of the universe. That Jesus is king of everything. So at least for Christians, we can remind ourselves on a regular basis who we follow. We don't follow a nation state. We don't follow a political party. We don't follow an earthly leader. We follow Jesus, who is our king. That's who we follow. It was interesting that after Pope Pius put it into our liturgies, when the liturgies of other churches were revised, they put it into. So it's in the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church. They all have the feast of Christ the King, because they thought, good idea. We're going to remember, too, that Jesus is our King. So what does it mean to be in his kingdom for you and I? What do the readings tell us today about his kingship? That first reading, those of you who are Old Testament scholars will know that that's the third time that David was anointed to be king. So maybe the church is trying to tell us in that reading today, sometimes it takes a while to recognize who your king is. Because it took 3 times. He got anointed when he was young, and then he got anointed to just do Judah. And then, as you heard in that first reading today, all the tribes anoint him to be king. So it takes some time to recognize him as our king, perhaps. Or maybe it grows in our understanding of what his kingship means for us. We get that beautiful second reading from Paul's letter to the Colossians. And I love that line. I love the whole reading, but there's that line that the Father makes us fit for the kingdom. So that's where we belong. I think kind of like a fitted sheet. You ever try to put those somewhere else? Or just folding them up and putting them in the closet. And I think, how do you fold a fitted sheet? Fitted sheets belong on a mattress. That's where they belong. And so God makes us fit for the kingdom. That's where we belong. But let me wade into kind of controversial territory here, at least controversial in the church's history. When fitted, merit. So in the word that the church uses most of the time is merit. And we hear it oftentimes in the liturgy. In the first translation of the liturgy into English, they got rid of it because it's a confusing word in English, merit. But when we redid it, about 12 years ago now, they put it back in. And so it appears in a lot of the prayers that we would merit the kingdom. You think, merit, what is, because for us, most of the time for Americans, when you merit something, what do you have to do? You have to do some work. I got a merit badge. I got merit pay. So merit is something I earned. And you can't earn this merit. That's not possible. It is a gift, but it's a gift that requires our cooperation. So here's a little imagery for it. You can share it with your Protestant friends when they say, well, you Catholics think that you have to earn your salvation, because we use that word merit all the time. So imagine a little 5-year-old kid who's in a candy store, and he comes out of the candy store with a package and runs up to his dad and says, Dad, I got you a present. I got you some candy. And Dad is just delighted to get the candy. But you and I know who gave him the money to buy the candy was Dad. And in this case, Dad owns the candy store. So that's the way God is with us. We think we're doing it all. I got you something, God. I'm going to give you this great thing back. And God's like, thank you. It's wonderful. But God gave it to us to begin with. And God has everything. That's merit. That little kid was engaged in merit as we use the word in the liturgy. He's cooperating with God's grace. Now here's the other part of the Catholic teaching of that, is that the more you do that, the more you are engaged in cooperating with God, the bigger the vessel becomes. So you get more. you become filled bigger with God's graces. And if there's a reward in heaven for that, for cooperating with God's grace, is that you had more of God here, and so you're ready for more of God there. Is there a good reason to act like Jesus here, to be loving and kind and forgiving and generous and filled with his grace so that you get more in heaven? Yes, because you're capable of more. So you keep growing in your cooperation with God's grace. That gives you a reward. It wasn't earned. It just happens. It happens by practicing what Jesus invited you to do. If you live like Jesus, become more like Jesus, are filled with Jesus and filled with his graces, yes, there's more. For those members of his kingdom, there's more. So the gospel today, what does it tell you about this King of ours? That his kingship came there on a cross. That's where he became our king, and that's what our king looks like. And so we, his servants, we, his members of his kingdom, need to realize that when challenges come our way, we are to be like the King who suffered for us. And that we too can forgive others from our crosses. That we too are invited to paradise. To know that in the midst of the challenges of life, that's what awaits. And because that's what awaits, we can do anything. We know where we're going. And we know who gets us there.